June 4, 1942, 400 miles northwest of Midway Atoll, 31,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean. Lieutenant Commander John Thach led his 6 Grumman F4F Wildcat fighters in a desperate weaving dance against 15 Mitsubishi, a 6M0 fighters that had just slaughtered his squadron mates below. His wingman, Ensign Robert Dibb, radioed urgently. 3 zeros closing from 6 o'clock high. Thach didn't run. He couldn't. The Wildcats were already too slow, already too low on fuel from the morning's frantic combat air patrol. Instead, he did something that violated every instinct of aerial combat doctrine. He turned directly into the attack. The lead Zero pilot, confident in his aircraft's legendary turning ability, followed eagerly. His 20mm cannons opened fire at 400 yards. Thach felt the Wildcat shudder as rounds struck the fuselage behind his seat. The armoured plate stopped them cold. More hits walked up the right wing, punching holes through the aluminum skin but missing the fuel tank protected by thick rubber self-sealing liners. Thach continued his turn, impossibly tight for such a heavy aircraft. The Zero pilot pulled harder, trying to lead his target. But Thach's manoeuvre wasn't designed to escape. It was designed to position his wingman. Dibb, following the choreographed weave pattern Thach had developed in training, came across perpendicular to the Zero's flight path. 6 50-caliber machine guns erupted. The Zero, with its paper-thin aluminum skin and unprotected fuel tanks, disintegrated in a fireball. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. By the time the sun set that evening, the Battle of Midway had changed the trajectory of the Pacific War. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers lay burning beneath the waves. But another revolution had occurred that day, one that would take weeks to fully understand. The Grumman Wildcat, derided by naval aviators as a flying anvil, mocked for being slower and less maneuverable than the Zero, had proven something more important than speed or agility. It could absorb punishment that would obliterate any other fighter in the Pacific and bring its pilot home alive. The philosophical divide between American and Japanese fighter design had been growing since the mid-1930s, when both nations began developing the aircraft that would define the Pacific Air War. But the origins of that divide stretched back even further, to the fundamental industrial and strategic realities each nation faced. Japan, resource-poor and heavily dependent on imported raw materials, approached fighter design with an obsessive focus on efficiency. Every pound of weight mattered. Every gallon of fuel consumed represented petroleum shipped across vulnerable sea lanes. The Imperial Japanese Navy demanded fighters with extraordinary range to escort bombers across the vast distances of the Pacific. They demanded extreme maneuverability to compensate for anticipated numerical inferiority, and they demanded these capabilities from engines producing less than 1,000 horsepower, because Japan's aircraft engine industry lagged years behind American and European developments. Chief Engineer Jiro Horikoshi at Mitsubishi Heavy Industries received his specifications for what would become the Zero in October 1937. The requirements seemed physically impossible. Maximum speed of 310 miles per hour, climb to 9,840 feet in 3.5 minutes, range of 1,240 miles with external fuel tanks, endurance of 6 to 8 hours, armament of 2 20mm cannons and 2 machine guns, maneuverability superior to all existing fighters. The power plant assigned to achieve these impossible goals, the Nakajima Sakai 12 radial engine, producing just 780 horsepower initially, eventually uprated to 940 horsepower. For comparison, contemporary American fighters like the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk used engines producing 1,200 horsepower. Horikoshi understood immediately that achieving the Navy's specifications required abandoning conventional fighter design principles entirely. Protection would be sacrificed completely for performance. The Zero would have no armor plate protecting the pilot, no armored glass in the windscreen, no self-sealing fuel tanks. The aluminum skin covering the fuselage would measure just 0.032 inches thick, barely 60% the thickness of standard American practice. Every component underwent ruthless weight analysis. The wing-to-fuselage attachment used a revolutionary design that eliminated traditional heavy mounting fittings by integrating the wings and forward fuselage into a single structural unit. Lightning holes were cut throughout internal structures wherever stress calculations permitted. The engine was positioned as close as physically possible to the center of gravity, reducing the tail weight needed for balance. Control surfaces used fabric covering instead of aluminum skin. The result was extraordinary. The A6M2 Model 21 entered service in July 1940 with a loaded weight of just 5,550 pounds. Its wing loading measured only 24.3 pounds per square foot. The power-to-weight ratio and wing loading produced turning performance and climb rates that seemed to defy physics. At speeds below 200 miles per hour, nothing in the sky could match it. American fighter development followed a fundamentally different philosophy, shaped by fundamentally different industrial realities. The United States possessed essentially unlimited industrial capacity, abundant raw materials, and the world's most advanced aircraft engine development programs. American designers didn't need to sacrifice protection for performance. They could have both by simply installing more powerful engines. Leroy Grumman founded Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation in December 1929 with a philosophy that would define his company's designs for decades. Build them tough. Naval aviators operated from aircraft carriers in the most hostile environment imaginable, landing on pitching decks surrounded by ocean. Their aircraft needed rugged construction to withstand carrier operations. They needed protection to survive combat damage and bring pilots home. When the United States Navy issued requirements in 1936 for a new carrier fighter to replace the biplane F-3F, Grumman's design team, led by Chief Engineer William Schwendler, approached the project with protection as a fundamental requirement, not an afterthought. The XF-4F2 prototype first flew in September 1937, powered by a Pratt & Whitney R-1830 twin Wasp engine, producing 1,200 horsepower. Early test flights revealed the aircraft was underpowered and suffered numerous deficiencies compared to the competing Brewster F-2, a Buffalo. But Grumman engineers persisted, redesigning the aircraft around more powerful engine variants and incorporating lessons from European air combat. The improved XF-4F3 prototype flew in February 1939 with redesigned wings, modified tail surfaces, and armor protection built into the basic design from the beginning. The production F4F3 Wildcat that entered fleet service in December 1940 embodied American design philosophy completely. Behind the pilot's seat sat a thick steel armor plate measuring 3/8 of an inch, angled to deflect rounds striking from the rear hemisphere. The windscreen incorporated laminated bulletproof glass. Additional armor protected the engine oil cooler. The fuel tanks featured self-sealing construction with multiple layers of rubber compounds that would swell when punctured by bullets, automatically sealing holes and preventing catastrophic fires. The structural design emphasized survivability. The fuselage used heavy-gauge aluminum skin measuring 0.04 to 0.05 inches thick, nearly 60% thicker than the Zero's skin. The hand-cranked landing gear retracted into the fuselage, creating extremely strong wing structures, but requiring pilot attention during combat that distracted from fighting. The overall construction was massively overbuilt by Japanese standards, sacrificing weight for structural integrity. The loaded weight of the F4F4, the primary production variant entering service in 1942, reached 7,952 pounds, nearly 45% heavier than the Zero. Wing loading measured 31 pounds per square foot, significantly higher than the Zero's 24.3 pounds per square foot. The power-to-weight ratio was substantially Satise's inferior. In traditional dogfighting terms, the Wildcat appeared hopelessly outmatched. It couldn't turn with the Zero. It couldn't climb with the Zero. Its maximum speed of 318 miles per hour barely exceeded the Zero's 331 miles per hour. The rate of roll at low speeds was adequate but unexceptional. What the Wildcat could do, however, was something far more important than winning turning fights. It could absorb devastating battle damage and survive. The armor, the self-sealing tanks, the robust structure, the thick aluminum skin all combined to create an aircraft that could withstand punishment no unprotected fighter could survive. But in December 1941, when Japanese forces struck Pearl Harbor and swept across the Pacific, American naval aviators didn't yet understand this crucial advantage. They only knew that Zero fighters were destroying Allied aircraft at horrifying rates across every combat theater. At Pearl Harbor, Zeros, flying combat air patrol, shot down several American aircraft attempting to respond to the attack. Over the Philippines, Zeros massacred American P-40 Warhawks and P-35 fighters. In Malaysia, Zeros outfought British Brewster Buffaloes. Over Java and Sumatra, Zeros dominated Dutch and American defenders. The mystique grew with each battle. The Zero seemed invincible. Captured documents from the Dutch East Indies campaign reached American intelligence analysts in late January 1942. The technical specifications seemed impossible. How could a fighter with such modest engine power achieve such performance? American pilots encountering Zeros reported that the Japanese fighter could outmaneuver anything in the Allied inventory. It could climb faster. It could turn tighter. Engaging Zeros in traditional dogfighting was suicidal. By March 1942, official United States Navy doctrine for encountering Zeros was brutally simple and profoundly demoralizing. Avoid engagement. Disengage when outnumbered. Do not attempt to turn with Zero fighters under any circumstances. Use diving speed to escape if attacked. The doctrine acknowledged tactical reality. Wildcats in the Pacific Fleet were predominantly F4, F3 and F4, F4 variants, weighing nearly 8,000 pounds, fully loaded with ammunition, fuel and armor. Against Zeros weighing 5,550 pounds, the weight disadvantage translated directly to performance disadvantage in every traditional metric of air combat performance. But weight disadvantage also meant something else, something American pilots were only beginning to discover through desperate experience. The extra 3,000 pounds of weight in the Wildcat wasn't dead weight. It was armor plating that stopped bullets. It was self-sealing fuel tanks that prevented fires. It was robust structure that withstood damage. It was 650 caliber machine guns with adequate ammunition instead of 2 cannons with countered 12 seconds of firing time. Lieutenant Commander John Thach, commanding officer of Fighting Squadron 3 aboard the USS Yorktown, spent the spring of 1942 studying every combat report from Pacific engagements. An experienced naval aviator with hundreds of carrier operations, Thach understood instinctively that traditional tactics wouldn't work against the Zero's performance advantages. The Wildcat couldn't win turning fights. American pilots needed new tactics that exploited the Wildcat's actual advantages while completely avoiding the Zero's strengths. Thach developed his revolutionary tactical formation through systematic analysis and tabletop exercises, using matchsticks on his dining room table to simulate aircraft positions. The Thach Weave, as it became known, used 2 plane sections, flying parallel courses with sufficient lateral separation. When Zeros attacked one Wildcat, that pilot would turn toward his wingman while the wingman turned toward him. The crossing maneuver forced the attacking Zero to choose between continuing pursuit into the wingman's guns or breaking off the attack. The tactic worked brilliantly in theory, but Thach wouldn't have the opportunity to test it in actual combat until Midway, 4 months later. In the interim, Wildcat pilots across the Pacific continued fighting the Zero with inadequate tactics and incomplete understanding of their aircraft's true capabilities. Fighting Squadron 211, based at Marine Corps Air Station Awa in Hawaii, received orders in late April 1942 for immediate deployment to the South Pacific. The squadron's 19 Wildcats would reinforce Efate in the New Hebrides, providing fighter cover for the critical supply line between Hawaii and Australia. Major Harold Bauer, the squadron's executive officer, supervised final preparations. Among the pilots deploying was Captain Marion Carl, an aggressive 25-year-old from Oregon who had joined the Marine Corps in 1938 specifically to fly fighters. Carl had accumulated approximately 400 hours in Wildcats, enough to understand the aircraft's handling characteristics, but with no combat experience whatsoever. Like every pilot in the squadron, Carl had studied intelligence reports about Zero fighters with growing unease. The statistics were demoralizing. In the Philippines campaign, Zeros had achieved kill ratios exceeding 10-1 against American fighters. Over Java, the ratios were similar. At Rabaul in January 1942, Zeros had destroyed numerous Allied aircraft while suffering minimal losses. The Zero seemed unstoppable, a technological marvel piloted by racially superior warriors with mystical fighting abilities. At least that's what the growing mythology suggested. But mythology and engineering reality were about to collide with devastating consequences for the mystique. Because the Wildcat, for all its apparent disadvantages in performance, embodied a fundamental truth about air combat that the Zero's designers had fatally neglected. In war, the aircraft that survives brings its pilot home to fight another day. The aircraft that dies spectacularly in flames, regardless of how beautifully it maneuvered before being hit, loses the fight permanently. On May 4, 1942, Fighting Squadron 211 departed Hawaii aboard the escort carrier USS Long Island, bound for the South Pacific Combat Zone. The pilots and their Wildcats would reach F8 on May 11th after an uneventful transit. Within weeks, they would discover exactly what Grumman's philosophy of protection meant in combat against the most feared fighter aircraft in the world. The USS Long Island reached F8 on May 11, 1942, disembarking Fighting Squadron 211's 19 Wildcats onto a crude airstrip hacked from coconut plantation and jungle. The pilots established primitive living conditions in tents, eating field, rations, and enduring torrential tropical rain that turned the coral runway into a quagmire. But the discomfort barely registered. 500 miles northwest, Japanese forces were consolidating control of Tulagi and preparing to construct an airfield on Guadalcanal that would threaten the entire Allied supply line to Australia. Captain Marion Carl flew his first combat patrol on May 15th. The mission was uneventful, patrolling empty sky over empty ocean, but the tension was unbearable. Every cloud formation looked like enemy aircraft. Every engine vibration suggested mechanical failure over shark-infested waters hundreds of miles from land. The Wildcat felt heavy and sluggish compared to training flights in Hawaii. The tropical heat reduced engine power. The humidity affected control response. The aircraft that had seemed merely adequate in training now felt positively leaden. On May 20th, the situation changed dramatically. Coast watchers on Guadalcanal reported Japanese flying boats operating from Tulagi Harbour. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, commanding Task Force 17 built around the carrier USS Yorktown, launched strikes against Japanese positions. The attacks sank or damaged numerous vessels and destroyed aircraft, but they also alerted Japanese forces to American naval presence in the region. The stage was set for the Battle of the Coral Sea, the first naval battle in history where surface ships never sighted each other directly. Carrier aircraft would decide the outcome, and for the first time, substantial numbers of Wildcats would engage substantial numbers of Zeros in extended combat, providing the data that would ultimately reveal the true balance of capabilities. May 7th, 1942. May 7th, with both sides, the Japanese struck the fleet oiler USS Neosho and destroyer USS Sims, sinking both vessels. American aircraft struck the light carrier Shoho, sinking her with devastating torpedo and bomb hits. Zero fighters flying combat air patrol engaged American dive bombers and torpedo bombers, shooting down several aircraft, but Wildcat escorts proved surprisingly difficult to destroy. Lieutenant Commander Paul Ramsey, leading Fighting Squadron 2 from the USS Lexington, engaged Zeros, protecting Japanese bombers attacking American carriers. His Wildcat absorbed multiple 20mm cannon strikes that punched through the aluminum skin but failed to penetrate the armor plate, protecting him from the rear. The self-sealing fuel tanks automatically sealed bullet holes, preventing the catastrophic fires that consumed Japanese aircraft with similar damage. Ramsey destroyed 1-0 with a deflection shot that ignited the unprotected fuel tanks instantly. The Japanese fighter fell away trailing flame, the pilot making no attempt to bail out. In 3 seconds, the Zero transformed from deadly opponent to flaming wreckage. Ramsey's Wildcat, despite absorbing damage that would have destroyed a Zero, flew back to Lexington and landed successfully. Mechanics counted 17 bullet and cannon shell holes in the fuselage and wings. None had penetrated vital systems. The armor had stopped rounds that would have killed the pilot. The self-sealing tanks had prevented fire. The robust structure had maintained integrity despite multiple hits. The pattern repeated across dozens of engagements during the 2-day battle. Wildcats absorbed punishment that seemed impossible. Zeros that suffered even moderate damage frequently caught fire or broke apart structurally. The American philosophy of protection versus the Japanese philosophy of performance was being tested under the most extreme conditions imaginable, and the results contradicted every assumption about the Zero's invincibility. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. On May 8th, the battle reached its climax. Japanese strike aircraft attacked the American carriers with devastating effectiveness. The USS Lexington, struck by multiple torpedoes and bombs, would eventually sink despite heroic damage control efforts. The USS Yorktown suffered bomb damage but remained operational. American strikes heavily damaged the fleet carrier Shokaku, putting her out of action for months. Throughout the day's combat, Zero fighters engaged Wildcat escorts in furious dogfights. Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Flatley, commanding Fighting Squadron 42 from the Yorktown, led his pilots in slashing attacks that exploited the Wildcat's diving speed and structural strength. The tactic that would become standard doctrine was already emerging from desperate necessity. Dive on the enemy from altitude, make one firing pass. Use the speed gained in the dive to zoom climb back to altitude. Never turn with Zeros at low speed under any circumstances. Flatley's Wildcat absorbed catastrophic damage during one engagement when a Zero's 20mm cannon struck the fuselage repeatedly. 3 shells penetrated the engine cowling, damaging cylinders and severing oil lines. Black smoke streamed from the engine. 2 more shells struck the fuselage behind the cockpit, stopped completely by the 3/8-inch armor plate. The impacts felt like sledgehammer blows against Flatley's seat back, but the steel held firm. Flatley nursed the crippled Wildcat back to the Yorktown, the engine running rough but still producing sufficient power for flight. He landed successfully with hydraulic fluid and oil streaming from multiple wounds. Maintenance personnel were astonished the aircraft had remained airborne. They counted 32 holes from cannon shells and machine gun bullets. The armor plate behind the seat showed 3 deep impact craters where cannon shells had struck but failed to penetrate. Without that armor, all 3 shells would have passed directly through the pilot's torso, killing him instantly. The maintenance chief, a career Navy man who had worked on aircraft since biplane days, stood shaking his head in disbelief. "Sir, I've never seen an aircraft take this kind of punishment and fly home," he told Flatley. "Whatever Grumman's building into these things, it works." The Battle of the Coral Sea ended in tactical stalemate but strategic American victory. The Japanese advance toward Port Moresby was halted. More importantly, Japanese naval aviation suffered losses in aircrew and aircraft that could not be easily replaced. American losses were severe. The Lexington sunk, the Yorktown damaged, numerous aircraft destroyed, but American industrial capacity could replace material losses within months. American training programs could produce replacement pilots continuously, and American aviators had learned something crucial about their Wildcats. The aircraft that seemed hopelessly outmatched by zero performance could survive battle damage that would destroy any Japanese fighter. That survivability meant pilots who absorbed damage could return, repair their aircraft, and fly again the next day. Zero pilots who absorbed similar damage died in flaming wrecks. 4 weeks later, the significance of Grumman's design philosophy would become undeniable during the most important naval battle of the Pacific War. June 4, 1942. Midway Atoll, 1,300 miles northwest of Pearl Harbor. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto led the most powerful fleet Japan had ever assembled toward the tiny coral island, planning to destroy the remnants of American carrier forces and establish Japanese dominance across the Central Pacific. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, carried the most experienced naval aviators in the world. Veterans of Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, and the Indian Ocean. Defending Midway were 27 Wildcats from Marine Fighting Squadron 221, led by Major Floyd Parks. The Marine pilots were young, inexperienced, and flying from a land base with minimal support facilities. Most had fewer than 300 hours total flight time. None had combat experience. They would face zero pilots who averaged over 1,000 hours and multiple combat campaigns. At 615 hours, radar operators on Midway detected incoming Japanese aircraft 93 miles out. The Wildcats scrambled immediately, climbing desperately for altitude. By 6:30 hours, they had reached 14,000 feet when the Japanese Strike Force 36, Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers, 36 Aichi D-3A Valdive bombers, and 36 Zero fighters appeared from the northwest at a 19,000 feet altitude advantage. Major Parks led his Marines directly into the formation, attacking the bombers head-on to disrupt their bombing runs. The Zeros dove immediately, engaging the Wildcats with devastating effectiveness. The Marine pilots, despite courage and determination, lacked the tactical sophistication to counter the Zeros' advantages. They attempted traditional dogfighting maneuvers, turning with Zeros at low speeds where the Japanese fighters dominated absolutely. The results were catastrophic. Within 15 minutes of furious combat, 15 of 27 Wildcats were shot down or so severely damaged, they crashed attempting to return to Midway. Major Parks died in the flaming wreckage of his aircraft. Captain Kirk Armistead assumed command of the shattered squadron. The Japanese strike force, despite Marine resistance, bombed Midway's installations with impunity. But the battle was only beginning. 50 miles north, the American carriers USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and USS Yorktown were launching their own strikes against the Japanese fleet, and the carrier-based Wildcat squadrons would demonstrate tactical sophistication the Marine pilots at Midway had lacked. Lieutenant Commander John Thach led Fighting Squadron 3 from the Yorktown in escort of torpedo bombers attacking the Japanese carriers. At 10:20 hours, his 6 Wildcats encountered 15 Zeros flying combat air patrol above the Japanese fleet. Thach immediately put his weave tactic into practice, pairing aircraft and maintaining disciplined formation despite overwhelming numerical odds. The Zeros attacked aggressively, confident in their ability to overwhelm the outnumbered Americans through superior maneuverability. The lead Zero pilot selected Thach as his target, positioning behind the American commander and opening fire with cannon and machine guns. Thach felt impacts against his aircraft as rounds struck the fuselage. The armor plate stopped them. He continued his turn toward his wingman's position. The Zero pilot, focused on maintaining his firing solution, followed into the turn. He never saw Ensign Robert Dibb crossing perpendicular to his flight path until 650 caliber. Machine guns erupted. The concentrated fire lasted less than 2 seconds. 30 rounds struck the Zero across the fuselage and wing root. The unprotected fuel tanks ignited instantly. The aircraft disintegrated in a fireball so violent that debris scattered across hundreds of yards of sky. Thach reversed his weave, crossing back toward Dib's position. Another Zero attacking Dib followed, focused entirely on his target. Thach fired a 3-second burst from 400 yards. Incendiary rounds ignited the Zero's fuel tanks. The Japanese fighter fell away burning, trailing smoke and flame. The pilot never attempted to bail out, likely killed by 50 caliber rounds that passed completely through the unarmored cockpit. The engagement lasted 20 minutes. Thach's 6 Wildcats destroyed 5 Zeros, confirmed with 2 more probables. The Americans lost 1 aircraft when Ensign William Bassett's Wildcat suffered engine damage and crashed in the ocean. Bassett survived, rescued 3. Days later, by a PBY Catalina flying boat, his Wildcat had absorbed over 40 bullet and cannon hits before the engine finally failed. The armor had protected him from injury. The self-sealing tanks had prevented fire. The aircraft had remained controllable long enough for him to reach the water and execute a controlled ditching. Meanwhile, American dive bombers achieved the most devastating success in naval aviation history. At 10:25 hours, 37 SBD Dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise and Yorktown struck the Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu simultaneously. The carriers, caught with armed and fueled aircraft on their decks while rearming from the Midway strike, exploded in massive conflagrations. Within 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers were burning wrecks that would sink within hours. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, launched a counterattack that struck the Yorktown twice, knocking her out of action. But American dive bombers found Hiryu later, that afternoon, destroying her with multiple bomb hits. By evening, all 4 Japanese carriers were sinking. Japan's naval air power had been gutted in a single day of desperate combat. The Battle of Midway proved beyond doubt that the Pacific War had reached a turning point. But for naval aviators, the battle proved something equally important about their Wildcats. The aircraft could survive combat with Zeros if pilots used proper tactics that exploited American advantages while avoiding Japanese strengths. Captain Marion Carl, still stationed at F8 with Fighting Squadron 211, studied the Midway combat reports with intense interest when they reached the South Pacific in late June. The lessons were clear. Never dogfight Zeros at low speed. Always maintain altitude and speed advantage. Use diving attacks and zoom climbs. Exploit the Wildcat's superior diving speed and structural strength. Trust the armor and self-sealing tanks to protect you when hit. Carl would have the opportunity to apply these lessons personally very soon, because in early August 1942, American forces launched Operation Watchtower, the invasion of Guadalcanal, and Marine aviators flying Wildcats from Henderson Field would engage in the most sustained, brutal air combat of the entire Pacific War. August 7, 1942. American Marines stormed ashore on Guadalcanal, capturing the partially completed Japanese airfield with minimal resistance. Within days, Marine engineers had the runway operational. On August 20th, Fighting Squadron 223 arrived with 19 Wildcats, establishing the first American air presence in the Solomon Islands combat zone. The Japanese response was immediate and overwhelming. From Rabaul, 600 miles northwest, Japanese bombers and Zero fighters launched daily raids attempting to destroy Henderson Field and the Marines defending it. The Coast Watcher network, Australian and British personnel hiding in Mystic, Japanese-occupied territory, provided early warning of incoming raids, giving the Wildcats time to scramble and gain altitude. Captain Marion Carl, transferred to Guadalcanal with several other experienced pilots to reinforce the battered Marine squadrons, flew his first combat mission on August 24th. The mission began routinely. Coast Watcher warning indicated Japanese aircraft approaching from the northwest. Carl's division of 4 Wildcats scrambled at 11:30 hours, climbing to 20,000 feet altitude. At 12:15 hours, The raid appeared 18 G4M Betty bombers escorted by 12 Zeros. Carl led his division in a diving attack on the bomber formation, targeting the leader. He opened fire at 600 yards, walking his tracers into Betty's right engine. The bomber caught fire immediately and fell away. Carl zoomed back to altitude using the speed gained in his dive, executing the tactic exactly as doctrine prescribed. But 3 Zeros had seen his attack and dove in pursuit. Carl reversed hard left, checking his 6 o'clock. The lead Zero was closing rapidly, already opening fire at extreme range. Carl felt and heard impacts as 20mm shells struck his Wildcat. The first shell punched through the right wing, missing the fuel tank by inches. The second shell struck the fuselage just behind the cockpit, penetrating the aluminum skin but stopping against the armor plate with a tremendous clang that Carl felt through his seat. He pushed the stick forward, diving steeply while pulling negative Gs. The Wildcat accelerated rapidly. At 300 miles per hour indicated airspeed, Carl rolled hard right, exploiting the Wildcat's superior roll rate at high speeds. The pursuing Zero attempted to follow but couldn't match the roll rate. Carl reversed left, then right again, scissoring violently. The Zero pilot, trying to maintain position, fell behind in the rolling maneuvers. Carl's wingman, Lieutenant David Hyman, crossed behind the Zero and opened fire. The 650 caliber machine guns converged at 300 yards, exactly where the Zero was flying. Incendiary rounds ignited the fuel tanks. The Zero exploded so violently that burning fragments struck Hyman's Wildcat, damaging the propeller and cracking the windscreen. Carl climbed back to altitude, checking his aircraft systems. Oil pressure is normal, engine temperature normal, control response normal. Despite being hit by at least 2 cannon shells, the Wildcat was flying perfectly. He remained on station for another 40 minutes until fuel ran low, then returned to Henderson Field. Maintenance personnel counted 7 holes from cannon shells and machine gun fire. The armor plate behind his seat showed a deep crater where a 20mm shell had impacted with enough force to crack the steel but not penetrate. "Captain, you're one lucky son of a bitch," the maintenance chief told him, running his hand over the damaged armor. "That shell hit dead center on your seat back. Without this plate, you'd be dead." Carl stared at the damage, understanding viscerally what Grumman's engineers had built into his aircraft. That armor plate weighed approximately 40 pounds. In a Zero, eliminating those 40 pounds would improve climb rate and turning performance marginally. But that marginal performance improvement meant nothing compared to the difference between life and death. Over the next 4 months, Carl would become the Marine Corps' leading ace, credited with 18.5 confirmed victories. His Wildcat would absorb battle damage repeatedly. On September 9th, cannon shells struck his aircraft during combat with Zeros over Henderson Field. The armor stopped them. On October 2nd, machine gun fire stitched across his wings during a low-altitude strafing run. The self-sealing tanks are sealed automatically. On November 11th, a 20mm shell exploded against his engine, damaging cylinders and severing fuel lines. He flew the crippled Wildcat back to Henderson and landed successfully. By December 1942, when Carl rotated back to the United States for leave and reassignment as a flight instructor, his Wildcat had absorbed over 100 documented hits from enemy fire. The aircraft was so extensively damaged that maintenance personnel cannibalized it for spare parts rather than attempting complete restoration. But it had brought Carl home alive from every combat mission. The pattern Carl experienced was repeated across dozens of Wildcat pilots throughout the Guadalcanal campaign. The statistics were remarkable, and grew more remarkable as the campaign progressed. In August 1942, when Marine pilots first arrived at Henderson Field, Zero fighters still held performance advantages in traditional dogfighting metrics. The kill ratio favored Japan, though not as dramatically as in earlier campaigns. By September, as American pilots gained experience and refined their tactics, the kill ratios approached parity. Wildcats and Zeros were destroying each other at roughly equal rates. But American aircraft that sustained moderate damage frequently returned to base and flew again after repairs. Japanese aircraft that sustained similar damage typically crashed or burned, killing their pilots permanently. By October and November, the balance had shifted decisively. Wildcat pilots were destroying Zeros at rates approaching 2-to-1. The difference wasn't improved performance. The Wildcat remained slower and less maneuverable than the Zero. The difference was systematic exploitation of American advantages combined with absolute avoidance of Japanese advantages. Maintain altitude. Dive through the enemy formation. Fire a concentrated burst. Zoom, climb back to altitude using excess speed. Never turn at low speeds. If hit, trust the armor and self-sealing tanks. The tactics seemed simple, but they required discipline that inexperienced pilots often lacked. Marines who forgot the lessons and attempted traditional dogfighting usually died quickly, validating the doctrine through tragic negative examples. Lieutenant Jefferson de Blanc arrived at Guadalcanal in November 1942 with Fighting Squadron 112. On January 31, 1943, he led a 6-plane escort mission protecting Army Air Force dive bombers attacking Japanese shipping off Vella La Vella. The formation encountered overwhelming Japanese opposition, approximately 40 Zero fighters. De Blanc's division engaged immediately, dogfighting at high altitude where the Wildcats' advantages in diving speed and structural strength remained relevant. De Blanc destroyed 3 Zeros, confirmed with 2 probables during 40 minutes of continuous combat, but his Wildcat absorbed catastrophic damage. 20mm shells struck the engine, holing cylinders and destroying the propeller governor. Machine gun fire stitched across the wings, puncturing fuel tanks that sealed automatically. More cannon shells struck the fuselage, stopped by armor plating. The engine finally seized completely, the propeller freezing solid. De Blanc glided toward the water, configuring for emergency ditching. He struck the ocean at 80 knots, the impact violent but controlled. The Wildcat's structure absorbed the forces without breaking apart. De Blanc escaped the sinking aircraft and inflated his life raft. He spent 3 days drifting before friendly coast watchers rescued him from Japanese-occupied territory. When he returned to American lines 2 weeks later, after harrowing experiences hiding from Japanese patrols, de Blanc described his aircraft's performance under extreme damage. The Wildcat took everything they threw at it and kept flying until there was literally nothing left to fly with, he told intelligence officers. The armor saved my life at least 3 times during that fight. The fuel tanks sealed themselves. The structure held together when it should have broken apart. Grumman built one hell of an airplane. De Blanc received the Medal of Honor for his actions that day, but he always insisted the real credit belonged to Grumman's engineers who designed an aircraft that could absorb over 200 documented hits and still bring its pilot home alive. By early 1943, the Wildcat's reputation had transformed completely from the dark days of late 1941. No longer derided as a flying anvil hopelessly outmatched by the Zero, the Wildcat was recognized as exactly what Leroy Grumman had designed, a fighter that prioritized pilot survival over performance statistics. The philosophical divide between American and Japanese fighter design had been tested in the crucible of sustained combat, and the results were undeniable. Japanese Zero pilots in mid-1943 reported increasing reluctance to engage Wildcats under any circumstances. The legendary mystique had evaporated. American pilots who understood their aircraft's true capabilities and applied proper tactics could impose their own terms on every engagement. And even when Japanese pilots achieved firing solutions and scored hits, the Wildcats frequently absorbed the damage and escaped. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's leading fighter aces with over 60 confirmed victories, described the evolution in his post-war writings. In 1941 and early 1942, we held all advantages, Sakai wrote. Our Zero could outmaneuver any Allied fighter. Our pilots had superior training and experience. But by mid-1943, the Americans had learned. Their Wildcat pilots refused to fight on our terms. They maintained altitude and speed discipline religiously, and when we hit them, they wouldn't die. American aircraft absorbed damage that would destroy 10 Zeros and still flew home. It was devastating for our morale. Thach himself experienced the Wildcat's survivability personally during the Guadalcanal campaign. On August 7, 1942, he engaged a formation of American dive bombers escorted by Wildcats. He destroyed one bomber with cannon fire, then positioned behind a Wildcat for what appeared to be an easy kill. Thach opened fire at 400 yards, observing hits across the American fighter's fuselage and wings. The Wildcat didn't catch fire, didn't break apart, didn't even seem affected by the damage. The American pilot Thach never learned his name rolled hard right at high speed, a maneuver Thach couldn't match in his Zero. By the time Thach reversed direction, the Wildcat had disappeared into cloud cover and escaped. Thach had scored definite hits that should have destroyed the aircraft, but the armor and self-sealing tanks had absorbed the damage harmlessly. That moment changed my thinking about American fighters, Thach wrote decades later. I realized we had sacrificed too much protection for performance. Our Zero was beautiful in the air, graceful and deadly when undamaged. But American fighters were practical weapons designed for war, and in war, the aircraft that survives wins. The introduction of more advanced American fighters, the F-6F Hellcat in mid-1943 and the F-4U Corsair entering widespread service simultaneously, further shifted the balance. These aircraft combined overwhelming engine power with the same philosophy of protection that defined the Wildcat. The Hellcat weighed over 12,000 pounds fully loaded, nearly 60% heavier than a Wildcat, and more than twice the Zero's weight. But the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double-wasp engine producing 2,000 horsepower gave the Hellcat performance that exceeded the Zero in every category except low-speed turning. More importantly, the Hellcat incorporated even more extensive armor protection than the Wildcat. Pilot armor increased to half-an-inch thickness. Additional armor protected critical engine components. Fuel tank protection improved with thicker self-sealing liners. The aircraft could absorb damage that would utterly destroy earlier fighters and continue operating effectively. The F-4U Corsair followed a similar design philosophy with even more extreme results. Powered by the same R2800 engine in a lighter airframe, the Corsair achieved speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour. But the aircraft still carried comprehensive armor protection, self-sealing fuel tanks, and robust structure. Performance and protection were no longer mutually exclusive when sufficient engine power was available. By late 1943, American fighters were destroying Japanese aircraft at ratios exceeding 5-1 in most engagements. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot in June 1944 demonstrated the transformation conclusively. American pilots shot down approximately 300 Japanese aircraft, while losing only 30 American planes, a 10-1 ratio decisively in America's favor. The Zero had gone from seemingly invincible to vulnerable target in exactly 2 years. The transformation wasn't solely due to the Wildcat American industry. Pilot training, tactical development, and new aircraft all contributed. But the essential foundation enabling everything else was the philosophy Leroy Grumman had embedded in his designs from the beginning. Build them tough, protect the pilot, sacrifice weight for survival. The statistics told the story in numbers that Japanese engineers studied with growing desperation. Average Wildcat combat loss rate due to battle damage. Approximately 15% of aircraft hit sustained damage severe enough to prevent return to base. Average Zero combat loss rate due to battle damage. Approximately 70% of aircraft hit sustained damage severe enough to cause loss of aircraft and pilot. That 55 percentage point difference reflected the fundamental divide in design. Philosophy. American aircraft hit in combat usually survived. Japanese aircraft hit in combat usually died. Over hundreds of engagements involving thousands of aircraft, that difference became decisive. Japanese engineers attempted desperately to address the Zero's vulnerabilities. The A6M5, introduced in mid-1943, added thicker wing skin to allow faster dives. The A6M5C, introduced in late 1944, finally added armor behind the pilot's seat, 8 mm thick, barely adequate to stop rifle bullets and offering minimal protection against 50 caliber machine guns. But adding protection increased weight. The A6M5C weighed approximately 6,200 pounds, nearly 700 pounds heavier than the original A6M2. The added weight degraded performance substantially. Maximum speed dropped. Climb rate decreased, range decreased. The Zero with protective armor was no longer the Zero that had dominated the Pacific in 1942, and it still wasn't protected enough to reliably survive concentrated fire from 650 caliber machine guns. By 1945, Zeros were being shot down in horrific numbers daily. The philosophical gamble Japan had made in the mid-1930s, sacrificing all protection for performance, had failed catastrophically. The American counter-philosophy accepting weight penalty for protection and compensating with overwhelming engine power had proven decisive. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.